The day my brother slid that folder across the boardroom table and told me to sign, I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. And then I looked at the notary sitting at the end of the table and I set my pen down. That was when my sister in law stood up and said, "You don't actually have a choice here, Leigh. My name is Leigh. I'm 31 years old, and 14 months ago, I was a junior architect at a mid sized firm in Ottawa, quietly paying off my student loans and visiting my grandfather every other Sunday for pot roast and bad television. I did not think of myself as someone who had enemies. I did not think of myself as someone who had anything worth stealing. I was wrong on both counts. My grandfather built Ordercroft Construction from nothing. He started it in 1979 with a used truck, a small crew, and a reputation for showing up when he said he would. By the time I was born, it was one of the most respected residential contracting companies in Eastern Ontario. He never talked about money. He drove the same Ford F-150 for 11 years. He fixed his own gutters. He made his own coffee and he always had a spare key under the third flower pot on the left because he said you should never make guests feel like burdens. He died in October 2 years ago, quietly in his sleep, the way he would have wanted. And he left Aldercroft Construction, all of it, 60% of the shares, the equipment, the contracts, the land the yard sat on, to me. I found out in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning. My uncle sat across from me with his jaw so tight I thought he might crack a molar. My brother, who is 8 years older than me and has worked at Aldercroft in some capacity for most of his adult life, didn't even look up from the table. The lawyer explained that my grandfather had updated his will 18 months before he died. He had reasons. He did not put them in writing, but I knew them, and so did my brother, and so did my uncle, and none of us said anything about it in that room. My grandfather had watched what happened to his business over the 3 years my brother managed the Nepean contracts. He had watched invoices go sideways. He had watched a subcontractor relationship collapse in a way that cost the company $40,000 and two long-standing clients. He had watched my brother take a company truck to Tremblant for a long weekend and bill the fuel to operations. Small things, maybe, individually. But my grandfather kept a ledger the way other men kept grudges, patient, precise, and never quite forgetting. He left the company to me because he trusted me. He told me that himself 6 months before he died, on a Sunday over pot roast. He said, "You're the only one who asks how things work before asking how much they're worth." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I do now. The 6 months after the will reading were the worst of my life. Not because of grief I could handle. Grief was clean. What happened with my family was something else entirely. My brother called me 3 days after the reading. He was calm, measured. He said he wanted to talk about a transition plan, about how we could work together, about how the crew would need stability. I told him I was open to that. I meant it. I didn't want to gut the company. I didn't want to throw out a foreman who'd been there for 22 years because of family politics. But that conversation never happened. What happened instead was a campaign. It started with my mother. She called me every few days for the first month, always starting with how she was worried about me, how I was too young to handle something this size, how my grandfather must not have fully understood what he was doing. She said that word, understood, carefully, like she was laying it down and waiting to see if I'd pick it up. I didn't. Then it was the family dinners I suddenly stopped being invited to. Then it was the Aldercroft foreman, a man named Don who'd worked there for 19 years, calling me to say my brother had told him I was planning to sell the company to a developer out of Toronto. I wasn't. I had never said anything of the kind. Then it was my uncle showing up at my apartment on a Wednesday night with a bottle of Shiraz and a speech about legacy and how some things are better kept in the hands of people who understand the industry. I told him I was an architect. I understood the industry. He smiled like I'd said something cute. I started keeping notes around month 3, not because I thought it would come to anything, just because I have always been the kind of person who writes things down. Dates. What was said? Who was in the room? It's a habit I picked up from my grandfather, actually. He had notebooks going back to 1987. By month 5, I had a binder. The pivot happened on a Thursday in March. I was at the Aldercroft yard going over a materials order with the office manager when my brother walked in with two men I didn't recognize and told her, not me, her, that there would be some changes to the signing authority on the accounts effective the following Monday. He had a document. It looked official. It had what appeared to be my signature on it. It was not my signature. I know my own signature. I've signed enough drawings and permits and lease agreements to know exactly what it looks like. What was on that paper was close enough that someone had practiced. But the second loop on the G in my last name goes right. Mine goes left. It always has. My grandfather used to tease me about it. I didn't say anything in the yard. I walked back to my car and I sat there for 4 minutes. And I called the best business litigation lawyer in Ottawa. Her name is Beverly, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague 2 months earlier, and I had put her number in my phone on a day when I thought I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. Beverly told me to do nothing that would tip my hand. She told me to let the weekend pass. She told me that what I had just described was potentially criminal fraud, and that I should take photographs of that document before I left the yard if I possibly could. I went back inside and asked to see the paperwork again. I said I just wanted to review it. My brother hesitated. The office manager, bless her, printed me a copy without being asked. I had a forensic document examiner look at it by the following Tuesday. The report came back 8 days later. The signature was a forgery, the notarization stamp, and this was the part that made Beverly go very quiet on the phone, was from a notary whose license had been suspended in Quebec the previous year. Someone had used an invalid stamp on a fraudulent document and tried to use it to redirect signing authority on a company with assets valued at just under $3 million. I want to be clear about something. I did not feel triumphant when I read that report. I felt sick. I felt the specific nausea of having something confirmed that you were hoping was wrong. My brother and I used to build snow forts together in the backyard of our grandmother's house. He taught me to drive in an empty Costco parking lot on a Saturday morning when I was 15. I did not want this to be true. I wanted it to not be true so badly that I read the report twice, looking for an alternative explanation. There wasn't one. Beverly filed for an emergency injunction to freeze any changes to the company's financial accounts. The court granted it within 48 hours. My brother didn't know about any of this. Neither did my uncle. Neither did my mother. That was important, because the following week, my brother called me and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. He said he wanted to clear the air. He named a place in Westboro, a coffee shop we both liked, and I said yes. I brought Beverly's associate, a woman named Daphne, who looks approximately 24 years old and has the quiet precision of someone who has been doing this since before she could legally drink. She sat 2 tables away and did not look at us once. My brother arrived 7 minutes late. He ordered an Americano. He told me he was sorry for how things had been between us. He said the family had been under a lot of stress and that he'd been handling things poorly. He said he wanted to find a way forward that was fair to everyone. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a transfer agreement. It would move 40% of my shares in Aldercroft into a holding company that he and my uncle had incorporated in January. It was backdated to November, 1 month after my grandfather died, when, according to this document, I had apparently agreed to this arrangement voluntarily. November was the month I spent mostly crying and cleaning out my grandfather's house in Kemptville. I looked at the document for a long moment. My brother watched me with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral, the face of someone who has rehearsed for this conversation. I closed the folder. I said, I need you to know that the injunction was granted. He didn't understand at first. I watched it land. I watched the careful neutrality flicker. I said, the accounts are frozen. The forged signing authority document has been examined by an independent forensic specialist. And this, I touched the folder, is the second time in 3 weeks that a document with what appears to be my forged signature has been put in front of me. He started to speak. I kept going. Daphne, I said. She was beside the table before he finished his sentence. She introduced herself by her full name and her firm. She said she was there as a witness. She set a small card in front of my brother with the name of the investigating RCMP financial crimes officer who had received a preliminary disclosure 2 days prior. My brother looked at the card for a very long time. Then he looked at me. I think he was waiting for me to say something softer, to offer an exit, to be the little sister who found a way to make everything okay for everyone. I had done that my whole life, smoothed things over, kept the peace, laughed off things that weren't funny, made myself smaller so the room felt big enough for everyone else. I was done doing that. I said, I think you should call your own lawyer before you say anything else. He left without finishing his Americano. What followed was 4 months of the kind of legal process that nobody warns you about. Not the dramatic parts, but the grinding, exhausting, paper-heavy middle. Depositions, document reviews. A mediation session in January that lasted 6 hours and ended with my brother's lawyer asking for a recess that turned into an adjournment. My uncle hired his own separate counsel. My mother called me twice during this period. The first time she asked me to reconsider. The second time she cried. I listened. I didn't change anything. The forensic accountant Beverly brought in found 3 additional instances of financial irregularities in the Aldercroft accounts going back 2 years, all during the period my brother had authority over the Nepean contracts. Together, they amounted to roughly $87,000 in unexplained discrepancies. Some of it might have been sloppy bookkeeping, some of it was not. My brother's lawyer settled in February. The terms included full relinquishment of any claim to Ordercroft shares, repayment of $62,000 over a structured schedule, and a signed acknowledgement that the signing authority document had been produced without my knowledge or consent. In exchange, we did not pursue the criminal fraud referral to its conclusion. Beverly advised me on the trade-offs. I made my decision. I have been asked since then whether I regret not pushing for criminal charges. Honestly, I don't know. There are days when I think I was too soft. There are days when I think I made the right call. The $62,000 is being repaid. My brother has no access to Aldercroft. The company is intact. What I don't regret is not signing. Not on that first day in the boardroom, not at the coffee shop in Westboro, not at any point in between. My sister-in-law told me I didn't have a choice. She was wrong about that. I always had a choice. It just wasn't the one she was expecting me to make. I run Aldercroft now. I brought in an operations manager, a woman named Petra, who came recommended by a contact of Beverly's and who has forgotten more about construction company logistics than I will probably ever know. I'm still learning. I make mistakes. Last month, I approved a materials order without checking the delivery window, and we missed a port date on a project in Carlton Place, and I had to call the client myself and explain. I did not enjoy that phone call, but I made it. The yard still has my grandfather's coffee maker in the break room. It's a drip machine from 2009, and it makes terrible coffee, and nobody has gotten rid of it. I don't think anybody will for a while. Don, the foreman who called me about the developer rumor, came into my office in March and put a set of keys on my desk. He said they were the spare set for the main gate. He said he was just making sure I had them. I think about my grandfather every time I pull into that yard. I think about the notebooks going back to 1987. I think about the third flower pot on the left and the idea that you should never make people feel like burdens. The greatest thing he left me wasn't the company. It was the habit of paying attention before things go wrong, and the stubbornness to not pretend you didn't see what you saw. I'm still learning how to be the person he thought I already was, but I'm getting there.